Dr. Kalant.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the members of the committee for allowing me to speak to you this morning, or this afternoon now, despite the weather in Toronto, which made my flight impossible. Just before I make the points that I would like to talk about, I should give you a word or two of my qualifications. Apart from my position as a professor at the University of Toronto, since 1959, I was also the Director of Biological and Behavioral Research at the Addiction Research Foundation of Ontario. I have chaired or been a member of expert advisory groups to the World Health Organization, to Health Canada, to the U.S. National Institutes on Health, to the Addiction Research Foundation of California, and have published a great deal on alcohol, on cannabis, on opioids, and other drugs of dependence. In a debate which I published a couple of years back, in which I know that some of you have seen, I argued that decriminalizing cannabis now and pardoning those with past convictions for only the possession of small amounts for personal use would remove the harm caused by the present system without risking the problem of increasing the use in general, and therefore increasing the harmful effects by those who use too much. If one allowed an interval between the decriminalization and pardon to permit observation of what happens in other areas, in other jurisdictions that have legalized cannabis, and carry out necessary research, which I'll describe in a moment, then at the end of that observation period, one could do a rational cost-benefit analysis of legalization and make a well-informed decision on proceeding with it. If that is not possible, if the scheme that I've outlined is not possible, then the Senate's task is to make legalization as safe as possible without the benefit of the observation period. The CAMH recommendations and the Task Force on Legalization and Regulation both recommended that the motivation for legalization should not be for profit, but for the protection of public health while correcting the harms done by the present criminal law. However, the stock market activity in recent months and the constant media focus on profit and on the public use of such things as recipes for using marijuana in cooking, for using the marijuana leaf theme in all kinds of decorations, suggest that profit is a real risk for overriding the concerns for public health, and therefore it's extremely important to take every measure possible to protect the public health aspect. Mature, occasional users of cannabis generally will not suffer any serious harm except for those that result from acute over effects, such as motor vehicle accidents, injuries, and fatalities, such as myocardial infarcts or stroke in those with pre-existing vascular problems, or psychosis in those with a family history of schizophrenia. Otherwise, while occasional use is probably not the problem we have to consider, but in any large population, there are always chronic, heavy users who use too much and who suffer as a consequence a wide variety of health and social harms and harms to their social functioning. And a good deal of evidence from the study of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs shows that wider use is always accompanied by wider heavy use, and therefore an increase in serious problems. The factors that favor such an increase in use are ease of access, lower price, social acceptance, and higher potency of the drug. Ease of access by legalization has been shown in Colorado and in Washington to increase the total use and to increase the harms from from the sort of things I've talked about. And the one measure that the Senate could take that would help to prevent that would be to limit the number of outlets, to provide for a local option of areas, municipalities that do not want legalization, and to cancel the provision for home growth, because it is obviously impossible to monitor that home growth will be restricted to 4 plants as to what members of the family will have access to it, including even adolescents, and that to ensure that none of it gets into the black market. Price, if it's lowered to compete with the black market, will also increase use. Therefore, the proper measure for the Senate is to suggest a high price, even at the cost of not competing with the black market. And that's not a realistic hope anyway, because Colorado and Washington have shown that legalization has not resulted in a reduction in the black market. Police in both states have stated that the black market is flourishing. So that if the price is lowered to compete with the black market, it will necessarily require a strict limit on the amount that can be sold to any purchaser on a single occasion or in a given period of time. Social acceptance tends to foster the idea that the drug is harmless. The remedy or the prevention has to be educational programs, which I think that Dr. Porath will talk about more extensively today. But the education is not a one-shot wonder. It has to be sustained, long-term, varied in the means that are used to avoid boredom, realistic in tone, and it has to involve peer groups. Young people especially are more amenable to education if it's given by their own peer group leaders, the trendsetters, and that somehow they have to be involved. And finally, potency. I'm puzzled as to why Health Canada did not set strict limits on the maximum concentration of THC in preparations to be used medically. It is even more important to limit that concentration in preparations used non-medically, where there is no supervision of how and how often and how much is used. Finally, monitoring. If the results of legalization are to be monitored so that Parliament can correct any problems that may arise, requires that we have to know well what the present situation is, because we can't recognize changes from the present if we don't know what the present accurately is. And that also takes time. So my final suggestion is that the Senate should recommend a delay between adoption of legalization and its implementation for a reasonable length of time to allow education and to allow necessary research for defining the starting point to be carried out. With that, I think I should stop here, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may wish to pose.
Thank you, Dr. Kalant. And now